I was shivering in the police station at 3 a.m. The officer across from me tapped his pen on the desk.
You're a college student. Why do you think the stinky tofu from that store was soaked in corpse water?
My eyes were fixed on the handcuffs as I sniffed the lingering stench between my fingers, that unmistakable smell of death, like the ones I encountered in my work. My family has been in the funeral business for 5 generations. My grandfather once said,
The living have 7 orifices, the dead have 9. The 2 extra orifices are where the lividity and the stench of death come from.
Growing up in a funeral home surrounded by the smell of embalming fluids and decaying bodies, I've seen more dead people than alive ones. Every medical examination report says the same thing.
Exceptionally sensitive sense of smell.
So when my roommate, Amber, handed me some stinky tofu, I immediately vomited.
Seriously?
Amber said, stuffing the tofu into her mouth, clearly enjoying it.
This is from that trendy street food place near school. We waited in line for 2 hours to get it.
I wiped my mouth, unable to speak. The smell was indescribable, like rotten fish gills mixed with rusty surgical tools, exactly like the smell of a drowned corpse I processed last month. To get to the bottom of things, I followed Amber to the stinky tofu shop. A long line stretched out the door, and I grumbled.
Is it really that good?
Amber just shrugged.
I told you, it's a trendy place.
We ended up at the back of the line. At least the owner worked fast, we only waited about an hour and a half. As we approached the shop, the stench hit me like a punch to the gut. My stomach churned, and I felt nauseous. Amber didn't seem to notice, instead, she excitedly pulled me along.
You have to try it this time.
I nodded, forcing myself to focus on observing the shop. It was small and simply decorated. The owner, a middle-aged man with a perpetually cheerful face, expertly flipped the tofu in the oil. His movements were almost unnervingly efficient. I tentatively asked,
Why does your stinky tofu smell so strong?
The owner didn't even look up, mechanically repeating his actions. Our secret recipe, passed down through generations. I watched his face closely, trying to read between the lines. But he kept his head down, busily adding toppings to the tofu. I continued casually.
You're so busy. Why not hire more staff?
Amber chimed in from beside me.
What about your wife and kids? Why don't they help out?
The owner just smiled and handed the tofu to Amber. Here's yours. Next in line, please. Clearly, he wasn't interested in talking more. The people behind us grew impatient and urged us to move.
Buy and leave, make space for others.
Amber apologized somewhat awkwardly and dragged me away. We found a spot to sit. Amber immediately shoved the hot tofu right to my face.
Try it while it's hot, it's best that way.
I scrunched up my face and sniffed it a couple of times. The smell was unmistakable, familiar yet unsettling. Normal stinky tofu should have a fermented bean aroma with a bit of acidity and salt. But this shop's version mixed in an indescribable hint of something foul, similar to what I often smelled at work, corpse odor. I instinctively covered my nose, serious.
Don't eat it.
Amber didn't notice anything unusual, joking.
It smells bad but tastes good, right? You're just too sensitive, you can't handle a bit of smell.
She teased. I pulled Amber closer and whispered.
This stinky tofu smells like human remains.
Amber reacted with a mix of surprise and alarm.
Human remains?
Her voice wasn't loud, but it drew the attention of nearby diners. The owner happened to be cleaning up nearby and shot us a cold glance, displeased. Don't spread rumors, young lady. He warned. Amber realized her mistake and quickly covered her mouth. Her large eyes looked at me pleadingly. I subtly shook my head and whispered, "Let's go back to the dorm." I dragged her away, taking the unopened bags of tofu with us. Amber gripped my arm nervously.
Did you really smell something, or were you joking?
I just wanted to get out of there quickly. Back in the dorm, Amber started eating from the bag again. I was exasperated.
Aren't you scared? If someone said this had corpse smell, most people would throw it away.
Amber shrugged, unconcerned.
It might be unclean, but if eating it doesn't make me sick, what's the worst that could happen?
She continued. Lots of people are eating it too, not just me. As she stuffed another piece into her mouth, the tofu burst with juices that almost splashed onto my clothes. I distanced myself from her, frowning.
Did you mishear?
She asked, confused.
No, I said corpse smell.
I corrected her. Amber stopped mid-chew, unsure whether to swallow or spit. She thought for a moment before mumbling. Which sure? I calmly replied.
The sure of a corpse.
Her expression changed drastically. She clutched the trash can, vomiting uncontrollably.
Morgan, is this real or a joke?
She asked, face deathly pale. Amber stretched her middle and ring fingers to press her throat until she was empty. Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke weakly. How did you know? I kept quiet for a moment before explaining.
I have relatives who work at a funeral home. The smell is exactly like what I find in the morgue.
Amber's face twisted in pain. Regardless of whether what I said was true or not, it was better to err on the side of caution. She wailed. What about all the other times I ate it? I patted her shoulder symbolically. The previous ones are already gone down the drain. Even though I was certain something was off about the shop, I lacked concrete evidence to report it. So, business continued to boom at the Stinky Tofu place. Passing by the shop again, I spotted a familiar figure. At first, I wasn't sure, then I clearly saw the person.
Amber?
Amber jolted, with her mouth full of stinky tofu. She glanced at the tofu in her hand, then at me. Finally, she stuttered.
Morgan, why are you here?
I was annoyed. I quickly approached her, tossed the tofu into the trash, and led her back to the dorm. Didn't you say you wouldn't eat it anymore? I asked. Amber's eyes welled up with tears. Sorry, but I really couldn't resist. I couldn't eat anything else. Her expression seemed genuine. I'd heard that eating human flesh can be addictive. Perhaps the stinky tofu was causing a similar effect? That would complicate things. I looked at Amber seriously. From now on, I'm watching you. Absolutely no more of that place. Amber understood I was doing this for her good and reluctantly agreed. However, after that, Amber's appetite drastically decreased. She visibly lost weight in an unhealthy way, her eyes looked sunken, her mouth was pale, and she had no energy when she walked. Finally, after half a month, Amber couldn't take it anymore. She cried and begged me. Just one bite, please. I turned away, unable to bear looking at her. No way. Her condition was clearly withdrawal, she was addicted. But if she persisted, she could overcome it. Giving in now would undo all progress. I gently patted Amber's back and encouraged her. You just need to hang in there a bit longer, it'll get better soon. Amber knew my word was final. She nodded weakly, too exhausted to argue further. But to my surprise, Amber got into trouble a month later. At 8:50 a.m., Amber hadn't gotten up yet. We had 10 minutes before our class started. I knocked on her bed. Still not up? Amber was on the upper bunk, and I couldn't see her. I tried to stand on tiptoes but could only see the back of her head. She was curled under the blankets, unresponsive. This was unusual since Amber never missed our technical classes. Was she sick? The more I thought about it, the odder it seemed. I climbed up the ladder without hesitation. I pushed Amber gently, and she frowned, her cheeks flushing abnormally. She was breathing hot air. Something felt off. I quickly pulled back the covers, intending to take her to the hospital. But as I did, I gasped. Amber's neck and arms were covered in large and small boils. The boils looked ready to burst. I didn't dare touch her. I dialed 911. As her roommate, I went with her on the ambulance. The medical staff whispered.
Another case from that school?
I was about to ask what was going on when another staff member silenced them with a glare. The hospital was in chaos. Apparently, many students from our school had similar symptoms, drawing police attention. The officers looked at Amber in the hospital bed and motioned for me to talk outside. The hospital corridors were bustling. A policeman asked,
Has your roommate done anything unusual lately?
I shook my head.
Has she eaten something or injected anything?
I stared at the officer, surprised by the implication. Were they suspecting Amber of? That's not possible, I said firmly.
Maybe eating something wrong, though.
The officer, who had seemed disinterested earlier, perked up after I spoke.
Oh! Did she eat something wrong?
I explained the issues with the Stinky Tofu shop near our campus. The officer's pen paused. Do you have evidence? I fell silent. I really didn't have any proof. Smelling corpse odor is a subjective experience and can't be used as evidence. No, I admitted. Without evidence, it's just speculation, and they can't conduct a search. I glanced at Amber on the hospital bed, receiving 4 treatment. I nodded reluctantly, agreeing to leave. Back in my dorm, I couldn't sleep, feeling that something was off. Many students had been hospitalized, but that hadn't affected the shop's popularity. During my free time, I hung out in a tea shop across from the Stinky Tofu place, observing the owner's routine. Every morning at 7 a.m., he'd drive a silver van into the alley behind the shop and unload food supplies. For the next 2 hours, he'd prepare ingredients in the back kitchen. The shop would open around 10 a.m. and close by 11 p.m. after he cleaned up. I watched this routine for a few days without seeing anything unusual. But on the 5th night, I noticed something odd. As the tea shop was closing, I stumbled upon the owner acting suspiciously near the back door. He peeked around cautiously, ensuring no one was watching, then carried 2 large, damp-looking bags into the alley. The bags seemed to have water dripping from them, reflecting the moonlight. My heart sank as I thought of the liquid from body bags in a morgue. The owner loaded the bags into his van and drove off. I finally had my chance and couldn't miss it. I snuck into the shop when he was gone. Carefully lifting the curtain to the back kitchen, I confirmed there were no signs of anyone around. I stepped inside. The kitchen was much less hygienic than the front area, wet and sticky floors, mold on the walls due to humidity, and a constantly dripping faucet with leftover black stinky tofu in the sink. I frowned at the poor hygiene. Except for cleanliness issues, nothing else seemed out of place. But hold on. I sniffed the air, picking up a faintly noticeable stench. Following the smell, I explored the cramped kitchen and discovered a secret panel on the side of a cabinet. I pushed it gently, and it swung open, releasing a pungent odor that made me gag. Inside, old-fashioned lanterns were used for lighting. Pulling the cord, warm yellow light filled the room, revealing 12 large clay jars covered with oilcloth. Uncovering the nearest jar, a powerful stench exploded out. The murky brine contained grayish-white chunks that seemed like pickled tofu, but the smell was unbearable. My eyes stung, so I stood up to catch my breath. Fortunately, my experience with corpses helped me adapt to the smell quickly. Once composed, I opened my phone's camera to collect evidence. I mentally prepared myself, then plunged my hand into the murky liquid. Besides tofu, my fingertips brushed something soft, unsettlingly similar to human skin. As I was about to pull it out, sudden footsteps startled me. I panicked, restored everything to its original state, and hid behind the jars. Thankfully, the dim light made me almost invisible in the corner. The footsteps drew closer, and I felt cold sweat on my palms. The man's heavy breathing was pronounced in the small room. He examined the room, seemingly searching for something. After a long wait, an urgent phone call broke the silence. The man quickly answered and left in a hurry. I let out a silent sigh of relief once he was gone and fumbled in the dark to find the lantern's cord. A warm breath suddenly hit my arm, and I froze. Initially, I thought it might have been my imagination, but I quickly yanked the cord, and the room brightened. "What are you looking for?" A hoarse voice sprang from behind me. The owner stood in the doorway with an iron spoon, his expression sinister. I widened my eyes as my scalp tingled. I stuttered, unable to explain why I was there. The owner stepped closer, and I panicked, trying to push past him. Unfortunately, he overpowered me, pinning me to the ground after a brief struggle. Just as I was losing hope, the sound of police sirens filled the air, and officers burst in, forcing the owner to release me. The first officer to arrive helped me stand up. Before he could ask what was happening, the owner's demeanor changed. He feigned innocence. "Officer, this kid snuck in and poured something into my jars. And she was taking videos on her phone for attention," he claimed, pointing to my phone. I was taken aback by the sudden change in his behavior.
I didn't!
I protested weakly. "Then why were you there?" The officer's question hit the mark, but I stumbled over my words. Just as I was about to be led away, I remembered something crucial. I tugged on the officer's sleeve and pointed to the jars, warning. "There are bodies inside." The officer's pupils constricted, and he signaled his team to start searching. After what felt like an eternity, the air in the room became almost unbearable. "Report, Captain, other than tofu, we found some meat pieces." I watched the owner, who remained silent with his head bowed. I exclaimed. "It must be human remains." The meat pieces were displayed, 12 in total, one from each jar. The captain knelt down to examine them but shook his head in disappointment.
"These aren't human remains."
The owner pretended to be offended.
"Captain, if I had corpses, would I call the police? It's just pork for my secret recipe. You're causing me losses because you opened the jars early."
The officer looked frazzled at the situation. He gestured towards me. "Cuff her and take her away." I deflated, following the police calmly. Once in the police car, the captain slowly pulled out a lighter from his pocket and took a deep drag on his cigarette. He gazed at the shop's sign with a sharp look.
"How did you know there were bodies inside?"
I explained.
"I smelled it. My family is in the funeral business. I'm used to that smell."
The captain looked at me with surprise and approval.
"You've got a keen nose."
I raised an eyebrow at him.
"You're not mad?"
The captain shook his head.
"The place truly had a corpse-like smell."
He took one final drag on his cigarette before flicking the remaining butt to the ground.
"I've dealt with so many cases, seen countless dead bodies. I could smell it."
I asked, puzzled.
"If you noticed, why didn't you keep searching?"
"We need evidence to justify a search. Without knowing where a body is hidden, we can't just search randomly." At the precinct, the captain handed me over to a young officer for paperwork. The officer was typing away and handed me a form. "Fill out your personal info." Even in the middle of the night, the precinct was bustling, people drunk and disorderly, family disputes, fights, it was chaotic. 15 minutes passed before the young officer slapped a missing person flyer on the desk, complaining to his colleague.
"I'm so fed up, there's always so much going on."
The commotion caught my attention, and I glanced over at the missing person flyer. The photo was blurry, showing a thin woman in a bright red sweater with a young girl about 7 or 8 standing beside her. The young officer tapped the desk. "You done yet?" I returned my gaze and handed him the form. When I didn't respond, he looked frustrated and dialed my family. After a brief conversation, he hung up. "Your family will be here soon to pick you up." He then addressed me. "You're just a student, so this time we won't pursue it too seriously. However, you'll need to compensate the shop owner for damages." I nodded mutedly. My parents arrived quickly from the outskirts, about an hour away. They rushed into the station, eyes scanning frantically until they found me. After confirming I was fine, they let out a sigh of relief. My mom approached the officer.
"Officer, what did my daughter do?"
The officer hadn't explained much over the phone, so they were still confused. The young officer explained,
She snuck into a store at night. Fortunately, there were no serious consequences, but you'll need to cover the damages.
He handed them a note with the owner's contact information. My parents exchanged disbelieving glances, apologized to the officer, and promised to educate me better. Once in the car, my mom asked sternly, "What's going on?" I explained the whole situation, ending with a frustrated mutter.
Mom, I couldn't possibly have smelled wrong.
Dad listened, gradually realizing the seriousness.
Why did you risk going alone? It was dangerous.
Mom's expression turned grim. "You're right, don't meddle again. This isn't something you should handle." I knew I was wrong and shouldn't have acted so impulsively. Sorry, I was too reckless. The tension was palpable in the car. Dad tried to ease it. "She'll listen and behave. She won't interfere anymore." Mom's face softened slightly at my nod. It was past curfew, so I couldn't return to the dorm. Luckily, my parents had rented a small 2-bedroom apartment near campus for me. After confirming I was fine, Mom and Dad left. I took a warm shower and eventually dozed off, exhausted. I slept until midday and got ready to head back to school. Downstairs, I unexpectedly ran into the Stinky Tofu shop owner. Clearly, neither of us expected this encounter, and we both froze. The air was awkward as we locked eyes. Life is small, who would have thought we lived in the same building? I lowered my head and walked past him. After my parents lectured me the night before, I decided not to involve myself further.
Bang!
A loud crash followed by a groan made me turn around. The owner sat on the stair landing, clutching his ankle in pain. Seemingly, he'd twisted it. I couldn't just leave him there, so I helped him up. He thanked me, leaning his weight on me. "Do you need help getting back?" I asked. He nodded, and I supported him up to the 4th floor. We reached his apartment, numbered 402. His place was right above mine. But I kept this to myself, figuring it was unnecessary to mention. After dropping him off, I prepared to leave, but he invited me in for tea. I agreed and walked over to the dining table. The owner was caught off guard but quickly recovered. He hobbled to the kitchen to boil water. The silence was broken only by the sound of water boiling. I casually picked up a flyer on the table. It was the same missing person notice I'd seen at the police station, a woman in a red sweater. The owner noticed my interest and explained.
My wife and child have been missing. I made these flyers to distribute.
His tone seemed oddly calm. He handed me a cup of tea, which landed on the flyer, leaving it stained.
If you wouldn't mind, could you take some of these flyers back to school and ask around?
My in-laws are worried. I forced a laugh and agreed. The owner mentioned that my parents had contacted him about the previous night's damages. My face turned slightly red, remembering I'd gotten caught. "It's my fault, I should compensate you." The owner waved it off. "Forget it this time. You helped me today, so let's just leave it." He paused, curiosity sparkling in his eyes.
Why did you think my tofu had a corpse smell?
I panicked, meeting his gaze. His face lost any trace of a smile, and his eyes seemed unsettlingly black.
I just have a sensitive nose. I smelled something fishy in the tofu, but maybe it was just pork.
The owner nodded, looking relieved.
Well, that was a misunderstanding, but you're the first to notice that smell.
I hastily picked up the tea and gulped it, choking on it. Cough, I have to get back to school, I have classes this afternoon. The owner smiled and opened the door for me. I noticed 2 large trash bags by the entrance and offered to dispose of them since he was injured. However, he quickly moved to stop me, his actions a bit rough. The bag's tie came undone, revealing a red sweater. I quickly looked away, feigning calmness. "I'll just head back to school then." The owner hid the trash behind him and gave me a forced smile. I felt a chill run down my spine and instinctively helped him close the door. I avoided going back to the neighborhood for about 2 weeks. Recently, I'd been receiving orange storm alerts on my phone. If it rained, it would be inconvenient to return to school. Sure enough, a heavy downpour started in the afternoon and showed no signs of stopping. Impatient, I wrapped my study materials in a jacket and rushed out into the rain. My vision was obscured by the rain, and a sudden collision made me tumble to the ground.
Are you okay?
I wiped rain from my face, shouting to the other person. When they looked up, I was startled. "What is it?" The owner slowly stood up, hands on the ground for support. "It's you again. What a coincidence." He explained. "I came to reorder some tofu ingredients. There was a marketplace a couple of kilometers away, so it made sense. Maybe I was just being paranoid earlier." I decided not to say anything else. The rain was too heavy, and we just stood there, foolishly getting soaked to the bone. I nodded slightly, intending to leave. The owner, however, grabbed my arm and pointed to a nearby van.
How about I give you a ride? It's hard to hail a cab in this rain.
My instincts screamed at me to refuse. Just as I was about to decline, the owner winced in pain. "Ah, I think I hurt my foot when I fell. Can you help me to the car?" I was left speechless, refusing him seemed inhumane. So, I reluctantly assisted him to the van. The owner gestured from the driver's seat. "Get in, I couldn't leave you out here alone." As the rain grew heavier, many taxis had their
Occupied.
lights on. I gritted my teeth and took the passenger seat. The owner threw me a pack of tissues. "Wipe yourself off." The rain had soaked through my clothes, wetting the car seat, so I awkwardly dabbed at my hair and cheeks. We moved at a snail's pace, the heavy rain and poor visibility forcing us to slow down. The atmosphere in the car was awkward, so I tried to make small talk.
Hey, did you find your wife and kid?
The owner shook his head while keeping his eyes on the road. "No, but the police have opened a case. There should be news soon." I couldn't think of anything else to say and turned to look out the window. "Wait, stop!" I exclaimed as we passed my school's entrance. The owner turned to me, surprised. "Oh, I thought you were heading back to Maple Gardens Apartments." I hadn't mentioned living there before. He checked the rearview mirror and offered to turn back and drop me off. Given the late hour and the storm, traffic was slow. "Never mind," I said, trying to suppress my unease. "I'll just go back to the apartments." The owner didn't say a word. We drove for about 10 minutes before reaching Maple Gardens. Our building had fewer than 10 floors, so there was no elevator. The dimly lit corridors provided a warm ambience on the rainy night. As we reached the 3rd floor, I stopped and pointed to my apartment door. "I'm here. You go ahead." "Okay, rest early tonight," he replied. The owner smiled and passed me in the stairwell. As he reached the corner, I felt a mix of relief and unease. I inserted my key into the lock, but it wouldn't turn any further. Was the lock broken? Just then, a voice floated down from upstairs. "What's wrong?" The owner reappeared at the landing. His tone was soft, so the motion-sensitive lights didn't turn on. I could only make out a dark figure, which sent shivers down my spine. I gripped my key tightly, too scared to speak. The owner asked again. "Can't get in?" He slowly descended the stairs, stopping 2 floors above me. "Want to wait at my place?" he offered. I instinctively backed away, my spine against the wall. Since he'd gone to such lengths, I couldn't refuse anymore. I sat in his living room as he searched for a locksmith's card. He handed me the card. "Call them." I dialed the number. They quoted $150 due to the late hour and rain. I agreed and waited. The owner commented on the price increase but offered me a cup of hot water and gazed out the window. Still raining. He asked how long the locksmith would take. I recalled the conversation. About an hour. The owner hummed thoughtfully. I suddenly felt uneasy and stood up nervously. I need to use the restroom, I said, trying to play it cool. The owner directed me to the end of the hall. I entered, feeling a strong sense of dread. The bathroom door creaked as I opened it, releasing a familiar yet rotten smell. My body tensed. I forced a smile back at the owner before quickly closing the door behind me. The toilet and shower were separated by a curtain. Normally, it should be open for ventilation. My instincts kicked in, and I pulled the curtain back. On either side of the bathtub were two skulls, a woman and a child. The water was a dark, murky red, with visible chunks of flesh. Despite my experience with corpses, I was taken aback. Luckily, I always carry my phone. I sat down, legs trembling, and quickly dialed 911. Hello, this is the 911 center. What's your emergency? Before I could explain, the bathroom door creaked open. The owner stood with a cleaver, a wide grin on his face. Forgot to tell you, this door's lock is broken.
He said, advancing with the cleaver. It struck my head, and I felt blood trickling down. Using my last bit of strength, I whispered into the phone.
Maple Gardens. Before he grabbed it and tossed it into the bathtub. He tied me to a chair and circled me, seeming to enjoy the moment. Did you take my red sweater? He asked, his eyes narrowing. I realized he was talking about the missing person notice. My breathing turned rapid as I acknowledged taking the sweater. The owner's expression twisted in anger. This is all your fault. If you hadn't gotten involved, the police wouldn't have suspected me. He threatened me with the cleaver, the blade leaving a chilling trail on my cheek. You can be sure I'll implicate you if I get caught. Just as all hope seemed lost, the door burst open, and several SWAT officers rushed in. They pinned him against the wall. Seeing the police captain, my heart finally calmed. In the interrogation room, the owner confessed to everything, his laughter haunting and sad. I learned that his name was Raymond Wong Quan, and his wife was Emily Li Yen. Emily had been married before and had a child. The captain explained that Raymond killed her when he discovered her plan to leave him for her first husband. Emily's first husband had massive debts and was planning to flee overseas. Emily was initially angry and married Raymond without love, but later regretted it and wanted a divorce. The captain continued. Raymond found out about their plan and killed them in anger. I couldn't understand why the child was also killed. The captain sighed. The child was at home and witnessed everything. Raymond couldn't leave any loose ends. The captain added that the police had been monitoring Raymond and found my tip with the red sweater crucial. We detected a lot of blood on it, even though it was cleaned. If it weren't for that sweater, we wouldn't have started investigating him so quickly. I felt a mix of fear and relief. The news eventually broke, and the Stinky Tofu shop was cordoned off. People who had eaten there were horrified. Amber recovered quickly after learning the truth. Outside the shop, some social media influencers were live streaming. Here's the infamous murder shop. We're planning to sneak in tonight and live stream it when we reach 10,000 viewers. They even promoted a new, naturally fermented stinky tofu. Amber and I watched from afar, incredulous. She grumbled, "Some people have no shame."
I shook my head and pulled her away.
As the saying goes, people act, heavens watch. We can't control everything. Indeed, no secret can hide forever.